My name is Lizzy Wolfe. I am the rector here at St George's, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit tonight. Now, about 6 or 7 years ago, the church that I was part of sent a Valentine's card to everyone who lived in the local area around the church. That's not something that I've ever done before or since. A member of the church had the idea. She felt it was something that God was prompting her to suggest. We actually put it off for a year. Valentine's Day can be a sensitive subject, and we were a bit unsure about whether it was really a good idea. But the idea wouldn't go away. In the end, we designed a very simple card. On the front, it said, "You are loved and precious to God." And on the back, it just had the details of the church. We delivered a few thousand of them, and that was that. A year later, we received a letter from someone that we didn't know. She described how she had been at a very low point in her life, to the extent that she had actually decided to end it all. As she left the house to put her plan into action, her eye fell on a card on the doormat. It said, "You are loved and precious to God." Something about that phrase struck home. You are loved and precious to God. It was a turning point for her. She began a road to recovery. And a year on, she decided to write and thank us for sending that card. Now, today we are celebrating the baptism of some people who are loved and precious to God. We are also finishing our sermon series on the New Testament book of 1 Peter. Now, 1 Peter is a letter written by the Apostle Peter to some early Christians who had been scattered through what we now call Turkey because of persecution. We've been working our way through the letter, listening to what God might want to say to us through it. Today, we have come to the final chapter. And there are 3 things that I want to highlight. 3 words for you to remember: loved, humble, and strong. Now, the first part of our passage is directed to the elders, the leaders amongst the Christian community. But I was particularly struck by how Peter refers to those being led by the elders. In verse 3, he says, "those entrusted to you." We wouldn't use that phrase of something that didn't really matter. We only entrust things to people if they're valuable or precious. Church, God's people, God's flock, is loved and precious to God. You are loved and precious to God. That's why he wants to entrust you to good, willing leaders who will care for you and watch over you. We see the same message of love in baptism. We made the sign of the cross on each candidate because the cross is at the heart of our faith. Jesus went to the cross to rescue us from sin, darkness, and death. He was prepared to pay that price, to make that personal sacrifice. Why? Because we are loved and precious to God. Do you know that today? Whoever you are, whatever your background, whatever you've done or had done to you, Whether you're a regular here or whether this is the first time you've ever seen a church service, you are loved and precious to God. At the end of this talk, we'll have an opportunity to pray together, and we'll ask God to pour out his love upon us so that we can know deep within that we are loved and precious to God. So that's our first word, loved. If you remember, we had 3 words, loved, humble, and strong. So next we'll look at humble. Being humble is a key theme in 1 Peter. Earlier in the letter, various groups of people were instructed to be humble and submissive. In her sermon on free people 5 weeks ago, Eve talked about how that doesn't mean falling in line in a military sense. It's about cooperating with others. And there are important limits when faced with abuse or injustice. You can find that talk and others on our website under the Resources tab. In our passage today, it's the elders who are in the spotlight. They're told not to lord it over the flock, but instead to be good examples, eager to serve. But Peter also makes it clear that being humble isn't just for certain groups of people. It's for everyone. In verse 5, he says, all of you, clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. Now, I don't know how you feel about the idea of being humble. Is it attractive? Does it sound weak? Maybe you think it's okay for church, but it wouldn't get you very far at work. As Christians, we are all called to be humble because we follow a humble God. Again, we see this at the cross. Jesus, who was in very nature God, humbled himself by taking on our nature, becoming a human being. And then he humbled himself further by becoming obedient to death, even the shameful death of a criminal hung on a cross. As we think about being humble, it's important to say that we don't have to be humble in order to earn God's love. It's actually the other way round. God takes the initiative. He loves us first. He loves us no matter what. And as we receive his love, as we let it warm our hearts and change our thinking, God's love frees us from having to do something to prove our worth. His love enables us to be humble. So how could we be more humble this week? I'm going to give some practical examples, but I wonder what might happen if we all prayed, Lord, show me one step I could take to be more humble, more like Jesus this week. When we pray together in a few minutes' time, is that a prayer that you might want to pray? So what might being more humble look like? Could you be the first one to apologize? Maybe you need to admit you're struggling and ask for help. Maybe it's about trusting God with something instead of trying to control it yourself. Or could you draw attention to another team member's contribution at work? Whatever it looks like in your situation, our passage tells all of us to clothe ourselves in humility. As we take steps towards that, do talk about it in your small groups and networks so we can encourage and cheer each other on. So, back to our 3 words, loved, humble, and strong. We've looked at loved and humble. Lastly, strong. A few years ago, when our children were toddlers, we went to a drive-through safari park. We were all very excited as we drove through various animal enclosures. But as we got to the furthest point of the drive, which was the lion enclosure, one of the children began to get quite agitated and grisly. Then, out of nowhere, she was sick. She was quite small at the time, so I have no idea how she managed to produce quite so much vomit. She was sick all over her clothes, she was sick all over the car seat, she was sick all over our coats that were neatly folded up in the footwell beneath her. And then, as is sometimes the case with small children being sick, she immediately felt much better. Now, as I mentioned, we were in the lion enclosure. So there were a number of things that were not ideal about that situation. We couldn't get out of the car to sort things out. We couldn't even open the windows to get rid of the smell. But as long as we stayed in the car, we were safe from the lions. We decided that was the priority. So we carried on until we were able to stop safely and clean things up. Now, in our passage, Peter uses the image of a lion to describe the devil. In verse 8, he says, "Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in faith." Some of you may have heard of a book called The Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis. It consists of imaginary letters written from a senior devil to a junior one about how to tempt people. C.S. Lewis identifies two equal and opposite errors regarding the devil. On the one hand, some people decide they don't believe in the devil, often because they're imagining some kind of ridiculous cartoon devil with red horns and a pitchfork. On the other hand, some people develop an excessive and unhealthy interest in the devil, supposing that every small problem in life is due to direct intervention from the devil. C.S. Lewis says they themselves, by which he means demonic powers, are equally pleased by both errors. So we need to steer a wise path between these two extremes. In the safari park, it was important to recognize the existence of the lions outside the car and to realize that despite everything else that was going on, they were the main danger. Similarly, recognizing the existence of the devil helps us to see the main danger in the midst of all that's going on in our lives and in the world. Our human opponents are not the enemy. That's important as we think about living with humility and cooperation. Our real enemy is the devil. Ultimately, he is behind temptation, persecution, and suffering. And we must resist him, standing firm in faith. The cross is important for all our three words: loved, humble, and strong. We've already seen how the cross shows us we are loved, and we follow a humble God. The cross is also a place of victory. On the cross, Jesus overcame all the powers of sin, evil, and death. He defeated the devil. And that means when we resist the devil, we face a defeated enemy. We are strong not in our own strength, but in the strength of the cross. We're also stronger together. That might mean sharing struggles and praying for each other in our small groups. But our passage reminds us we also have Christian brothers and sisters around the world, some of whom, like the original recipients of 1 Peter, are suffering great persecution. The Christian charity Open Doors creates a world watch list each year, ranking countries according to where Christians face the most extreme persecution. Iran is 8th on that list. Now, we have the joy and the privilege of baptizing Iranians here today. And we are so glad that you are part of our church family. That privilege brings with it a responsibility to pray. Please pray for our Farsi brothers and sisters, both here and in Iran, to know they are loved and to be both humble and strong. Those are our 3 words today: loved, humble, and strong. All 3 of them are rooted in the cross. We are all precious and loved by God. We are all called to be humble, and we all stand strong together. Loved, humble, strong. Shall we pray?